Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, Chair of the Art Criticism and Writing Graduate Program here at SVA. Thank you all for coming. Bill Berkson is a poet and critic who was born here in New York and came of age as a poet and writer here. In 1970, when he was 30, he moved to the West Coast, landing in the poet's town of Bolinas and working in San Francisco, and that's where I first met him in the early 80s. Or maybe in 1978. Bill taught in the poetics program at New College where I was a student, and I took a seminar that he did there on the sublime. And now he's come here to talk about the divine conversation, so things come around. When we reconnected a couple of years ago, I interviewed Bill for the Brooklyn Rail, and in that interview he said a number of remarkable things. Here's one of them. If art is a form of social behavior, and I can't imagine it being taken as anything else, it exists as a sort of conversation. You make something and pass it along across the room, so to speak. You show it. The addressee may be specific or phantasmagoria. Here's another. Art, at this point, no one really cares if it's art or not, unless there's nothing else to call it, or unless it's so wonderful you can't find any other word to put in the face of it. Bill is a corresponding editor for Art in America and has contributed reviews and essays to such other journals as Aperture, Art Forum, Works on Paper, and Modern Painters. His recent books of poetry include Gloria in a deluxe limited edition with etchings by Alex Katz, Our Friends Will Pass Among You Silently, and Goods and Services. Other books include a collection of his criticism, The Sweet Singer of Modernism and Other Art Writings, 1985 to 2003, Sudden Address, Selected Lectures, 1981 to 2006, an epistolary collaboration with Bernadette Mayer entitled What's Your Idea of a Good Time? Interviews and Letters, 1977 to 1985. His Portrait and Dream, New and Selected Poems, will appear from Coffee House Press in 2009. Berkson was the 2006 Distinguished Mellon Fellow at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and he lives in New York and San Francisco. Please welcome Bill Berkson.
Well, that first quote gave the whole thing away. I could go home now. But the rest is elaboration. Is that a fan? We probably need a fan, right? Because it's Yom Kippur or something. The fan of atonement. I don't know, but I was having a hard time hearing Levi, so I hope you won't have a hard time hearing me. Let me know if you do, and I'll make amends somehow. I want to thank Levi for inviting me and for Yoon's tremendous help in setting everything up and making it comfortable and turning the fan on. So yeah, this I followed my own instructions, and the lecture is called Divine Conversation. Thanks. And so if it gets uncomfortable, we'll turn it back on. Divine Conversation: Art, Poetry, and the Death of the Addressee. And I like. A lot of this is quotation, and a lot of this is about quotation, and which is a form of conversation. And I love to use epigraphs, quotes at the beginning. So I have two of them. One is from John Ashbery, a poem called "The Recent Past. Perhaps we ought to feel with more imagination." And the other is from actually the hero, central hero of the talk, Edwin Denny, about whom more later. A quote that just, 2 lines, the end of a poem. He's leaving Rome. It's in the midst of a book called Mediterranean Cities. He's flying over Rome and saying goodbye. And the final 2 lines go, for with regret I leave the lovely world men made. Despite their bad character, their art is mild. So my theme tonight is conversation and its disconnects, you might say, or discontents, of which I am maybe one. So tempting it is to become a scold, but I'll try to avoid that. Conversation may be the intense, extended talk people generate among themselves, but also a kind of telepathy between the things some people do and those others who don't, but find them interesting to confront, and then the things that follow from that, and so on, everywhere. I mean the ongoing exchange, like of gases in and out of the body, that you hope never ends and know to be brief, unruly, and meant to be enjoyed as such. In substance, conversation is made of words that occur and flow in circulation to form what is at times momentarily and otherwise quite timelessly a discourse, and to that extent a company. He read his new poem before the entire conversation, a Parisian reported, of an event at Madame Rambouillet's salon in the early 1600s, the kind where Pascal or Rochefoucauld talked or listened or wouldn't listen, while the writers of the time, Jean Racine or La Fontaine, recited from their latest work. In the Renaissance, a type of picture showing Jesus and Mary seated in a company of saints standing around was called a sacred conversation. He got into a conversation that had started before him, said Boris Pasternak of his fellow poet Ossip Mandelstam. I quote a great deal because things other people have said or written have become part of my experience, and to that extent are there for me to say and say again, as much part of my vocabulary as anything else I could possibly invent. Saying these things over and over, I imagine a time when I forget who said what. Authority surely is not the issue. The thing said solidifies to a neat genetic energy bundle, and accordingly one feels impelled to add to it. Continue the conversation is a prompt I've heard more or less at my back for most of my writing life. The phrase implies a continuum of art as a field or social gathering across which possibilities move, change, emerge, and reduplicate over time, not necessarily in chronological order. And with the understanding that no mode, old or new, can ever be said to be dead, as in utterly out of the question, snub it as you may. Ezra Pound said the best criticism of a work of art is the next work. In normative criticism, the best of the rest takes the form of insightful prose appreciation. The worst is mere showing off, or some obstreperous opinionator pulling your coat. To operate within it as a field renders false the schoolmaster's concept of history as a forced march. History is where artists and artworks converse, a lot of it just beating the bushes, though surely there will be discernible highs and lows, healthy and unhealthy conditions. In this setting, every artist, even the oddball or hermit, is a breed of party animal, incapable of being oblivious to what's in the air. Among painter and poet friends, the artist most in the air this year has been Poussin, thanks to the recent show of his landscape paintings at the Met. The salient thing about the official critical response to the Poussin exhibition was that there wasn't any. All the serious attention of the art press went to the Courbet show, running at the same time in another part of the building. It's as if the voguish magazines knew exactly what to do with Courbet, who had kicked off the rage in modern times for great bad painting, and who otherwise had most of the right stuff for quick success in a newly surging art market, a loopy-minded radical provincial sharpie, preternaturally wise to all available attention-getting strategies. To some eyes, stacked next to Poussin, Courbet ranked suddenly, and perhaps only this once, as a somewhat cheesy, egotistical bungler with many interesting and some daring ideas and a hard time executing them. The type of criticism rife today that measures significance according to set notions of the state of the contemporary soul elevates a lesser artist as not only symptomatic of a supposedly general malaise, but everybody's cultural just dessert. We brought it on ourselves, this miserable art, they tell us. The press for Poussin brought only perfunctory, somewhat cryogenic accounts of his place in 17th century painting culture, and no sense that his art could be felt as relevant to how life is lived now, or how wide open, sensuous, often stirring, and full of light many of the paintings are. Seeing the Poussin show repeatedly with different friends, at least half of them painters, as surprised as I to be responding so deeply to an artist who before occupied only a curious sidebar in our affections, felt like entering that company the painter made for himself in Rome, the poets and scientists and intellectual laypersons who were his major patrons. Part of the excitement was to experience the conversational element of the pictures in its inclusivity, which is amazingly prismatic and one source of Poussin's uniqueness as a metaphysical painter, what he himself called his honnêteté. Letting your imagination wander through the depicted space, you see clearly the address of figure to figure, figure to dramatic incident, and all of those to the registers across the painted fabric of landscape and weather, and then, after all that, the address in the way of unfolding of the whole picture to you as you look, and as you look, to comment on it or listen to whoever is looking alongside you at the same time, too. It's not that the pictures are simply conversation pieces, but you feel the beauty, order, and passion generated from talk and mutual contemplation, the common culture of story, where antique myth was still a common thread, and philosophy a thing sociable people did together. In his large paintings of mythological figures in nature, Poussin becomes a great and generous storyteller, but you have to get up close and linger to see how great. Allow for that, and the nuance is enthralling. Nudged out of your reverie, you realize the museum is closing in 20 minutes and you and your friends had better move on to the next room. In a note to me about how uncanny are some of Poussin's details, the painter Mitch Temple remarked, "Atmospheres are divine, incidents profane." Then again, the incidents and atmospheres together smack of soil and fate, as Pasternak said, of those moments where art leaves off and a heightened sense of unself-conscious existence takes over. In terms of solidity and sensation, you could see in Poussin what Cézanne saw in him. In fact, seeing some of Poussin's architecture trees and rocks, his greens and blues and underlying clay, you see Cézanne. Everything good happens among friends, kindred souls, if you like, and if you do like, the qualification is no way restrictive. There is no world, and community likewise must be all in the making, or what my email server calls local contacts. If you and I, or few of us, had a week to talk together, and then another and another, over a year, we might accumulate a culture. My view of Poussin is conditioned by the imagined intensity of feeling between him and his friends for the pictures and what went into them. Such is culture, in which the terms in each new term, like for us or me now, Poussin, keep circulating. Part of what I do is dwell on certain interests over time, usually finding that what at first seems to be a scatter of unrelated scraps in progress reveals itself without much conscious effort on my part as a constellation or galaxy. Maybe not completely intelligible in overall shape, but the connections dot for dot are like synapses firing. As it happened, my final seminar at the Art Institute in San Francisco involved a last-ditch effort to have graduate students experience the terms of modern art free of the abstract preconceptions they have had hammered into them. I wanted the students to see paintings and sculptures in public collections as if the art was right before their eyes, to conduct, as Barnett Newman said he and his confreres were doing, an assault on the catalog, to tell in class what they had seen. Gene Swenson once remarked that the theory of Cubism was more visible than the pictures themselves. That was 40 years ago, 1966. So you can imagine, given the superimposition since of language away from what it's supposed to be about, the uphill trudge. But there were consolations. The best students were theorists in the classic sense of attentively taking in whatever phenomenon was set before them. Especially memorable was an exchange with one of the students, Reeves Grenade, who, after studying Matisse's 1905 sketch for Joie de Vivre at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, called the picture creepy. The psychedelic dabs and squiggles of Matisse's Fauvist vision bothered him, and likewise the way the smears of color resolved figuratively into pink male and female nudes, trees and goats, all of that lolling, shimmying, voluptuary stuff, which was terrific, to the point. All of that should be bothersome. And besides, the great thing was he was really looking, which, as I've said, was just about the whole point of the seminar. Reeves, in contact with Matisse's paint, had become that prime addressee, an audience of one. That he had mistaken the scene for the Garden of Eden, with evil writhing imperceptibly in the boughs, some 90 degrees off target, was a later revelation and understandable. Matisse's raucous little painting, sometimes called Bonheur de Vie, if you come to San Francisco, you can see it any time, offers a glimpse of daily life in the Golden Age, a time before neediness and struggle, outside of comfort, and a subject of mounting urgency that heated up as modernity developed its strange, irony-ridden mix of expectation, resentment, wonder, and despair. In Matisse, the pastoral infusion finally boiled over. It certainly hasn't been much seen or heard of since. The Golden Age, nostalgia for a time that never was, and its complementary dream of a perfect future, utopia's road to nowhere, through revolutionary politics post-haste, were modernity's gifts to its own ill-fitting sense of itself. Where did all that go? We will all drink champagne beneath the willow trees, went the old anarchist anthem, long lost in static of ironical qualification, not to mention coercion and mass murder. What good now is the vision of a beautiful life to us, who can barely conceive of any likely alternative to the tarnished, arguably leaden one we are used to? Is the Golden Age worth remembering? You bet. Because the vision, as Matisse reveals it, is neither so abstract nor far-fetched. It exists in the apprehension of a moment that includes one's deepest feelings for the world as one finds it, as it is. So, a note scribbled to myself in the midst of Reeves and my exchanges. À quoi bon? Asks Baudelaire in the Salon of 1846. Well, okay, he asks this of art criticism, but he has just finished an equally profitless boosting of art to deaf middle-class ears. What's the good? Le bonheur de vie, says Matisse, not in fact some remotest âge d'or, but that we have bodies, there are trees and water and light and air and art, all sustaining things, accessible via senses, as such primordial, hence golden, even arguably good. Think of modern as a place gone to. How long since we've been sailing to modernity? In Emanuele Crealese's film, The Golden Door, an alert Italian immigrant boy undergoes IQ testing before immigration officials at Ellis Island. The mysterious English woman, Charlotte Gainsbourg, looks on, then questions the reasoning behind the test. Astonished to learn that the latest data show that intelligence can now be measured genetically, she says, "You have a very modern vision." Modernity's deepest nostalgia, it turns out, is for the present tense. Actuality is missed most of the time. The issue of sensation, what Matisse's picture conveys above all else, seems tied vitally to appetition, literally a taste for living and the will to live. Bertolt Brecht in his journals took up Wordsworth's promise of a poem's efficacy to haunt, to startle, to waylay, and wondered, quote, at a possible criterion, does it enrich the individual's capacity for experience? And so Brecht finds, poetry is never mere expression. Its reception is an operation of the same order as, say, hearing or seeing, a human activity, a social function of a wholly contradictory and alterable kind, conditioned by history and in turn conditioning it. The Golden Age is an ancient fantasy of the primitive good life that became for a while a modern dilemma. Even before Matisse tried to enter it, the site of his happiness, essentially down by the riverside with no clothes on, became, in other equally desperate hands, anytime but now, anywhere but here. The stoicism underwriting Poussin's Et in Arcadia ego meets the Matissean rage for relief from the grime and missed connections of modern life halfway. Poussin went to Italy to find antique remnants as well as to find out how to paint. A couple of years after Joie de Vivre, Matisse went there too, to Tuscany and Umbria, with the Steins to see the Giottos and Pieros, after which his images of unfettered human existence intensified, enlarged, became more complex and heartfelt. Anyone who has ever gone to Italy knows that conversation there, even if you don't have much Italian, is a big part of life and an enormous pleasure. The language as such, its exceeding outward show, involving not just mouth and ear, but the whole of the body in play, Mandelstam called it a sort of immemorial Dadaism. Che succede? I don't speak Italian very well. You can tell. And for locals and visitors alike, the art, especially early Italian painting and sculpture of the 10th to mid-15th centuries, is famous for its healing properties. Not just good art, but transforming, because it takes you there, allows you a there to go to that feels situated just so. Nearly 200 or 300 years of healthy painting culture didn't happen by itself. And when it stopped, the turn-off into inferior showmanship marked a huge general loss akin to spiritual desolation. Europe's real Renaissance occurs in the 300 years before 1450, after which the soul sails out of it. The evidence in Italy of something gladly remaining, if only in the climate of the towns and the mostly ruined artworks kept there, is what keeps those of us who love it going back for more. It's an amazing country in that one has never done it all. There's always this place or other that you didn't get to, and so you say next time in hopes that you'll get another shot. 2 summers ago, I went to Turin because the Bruce Naumann show, organized by my wife Connie Llewellyn, was opening at the Castello di Rivoli, just outside town in view of the Piedmontese Alps. After some time apart, while she worked on installing Naumann's works, and I visited elsewhere with friends, Connie and I spent a couple of days traveling alone together and then geared up in Turin for the official opening festivities. Turin surprised me by being an attractive city with many of the refinements I had expected and missed in the other big towns, Pisa and Bologna, visited for the first time on that trip. The morning before the opening, I went to the extraordinary Museo Egizio, the Egyptian museum, which many people had said was the absolute must-see of all the sites of Turin. This collection, older than that of the Cairo Museum, was begun by the locally dominant Savoy family in the 17th century. On the ground floor was a dark gallery with dramatic spotlighting on 2 facing rows of monumental statues, images in basalt and diorite of pharaohs and gods. There were 21 alone of the warrior goddess Sekhmet, and others of Thutmose, Amenhotep, Hathor, Ammon, and smaller portraits of their wise old functionaries. I am not an Egyptologist. I don't like dramatic lighting, which in this instance was especially fancy, created, like they say, by a famous Italian movie set designer. And statuary I often find confusing. How do you talk to a statue? There is something ghastly in it, like the mummy's curse. Because, as with sarcophagi, even if nothing's really inside, just more stone, you're always aware that something is or was. Sculpture is an intrinsically haunted medium. Nevertheless, like most people, I am susceptible to the succinct grace of ancient Egyptian sculpture, as to the high, dry, exquisite forms and light of prime-time Italian painting. My first art experience, aside from comic strips and a smattering of distinguished pictures that I grew up with at home, was the mystical one of entering that eerie stone enclosure, the Perneb tomb, at one end of the Grand Hall at the Met, and seeing through an aperture the resemblance of another face staring out at me, so wide, with big pupils and a lot of heavy eyeliner. On location, as it were, at the Museo Egizio, one after another of these mostly seated figures addressed me as if directly. While they stayed in character, I felt alterations. The Hathor figures were especially striking, seated high up in the dimness around, and on the face, lifted smoothly engraved lips, communicative of benign, beyond belief assurance from out of nowhere. That gratuitous aspect is really the mystery, all the more so because, idle as I was, a lesson in how to be wasn't what I walked over from the hotel for. Rather than a subjugating hauteur, the votive figures presented a steady receptivity, as the French say, bien dans sa peau, easy in one's skin, so that I was seeing not just beautifully designed forms, but unforced examples of decorous ways to sit, topped off by great winning smiles. The persistence of that smile is a sculptural device going on theological. If you kept your eye on the physical expression, the ineffable parts could wait, explication deferred. Obviously, a high simplicity discovered in a museum isn't yours for the taking, like a postcard of the thing. The idea became experimental. Hours after exiting, I felt welcome to participate in it, if I could. At the Naumann opening, and later, hearing Rob Storr talk in the Costello Auditorium on Naumann and his work, I was still wondering about art and ethical grandeur, and how the Egyptian artists could show the balance so readily. On stage, Rob discussed the virtues of the Naumann show and of Naumann's art generally, impromptu. A few notes jotted on a small scrap of paper fed into rapid, emphatic, fully worked out sentences, and almost every word dovetailing with the reverberations from that part of the morning spent in my Egyptian trance. What I assume, you shall assume, Rob startled me, quoting Whitman. Then, commenting on Whitman's and by extension Naumann's generosity, the open sociability of each toward the addressee, the poet is interested in who you are. Because Rob's talk wasn't written out and probably will never be, I'm taking the liberty of quoting from it here at length. I got a tape of it from the Costello. Referring to the role Naumann gives to ethics in his work, and going on as the translator converted his American, phrase by phrase, into Italian on the spot, quote, Naumann is not unaware of what goes on around him. He is an artist who uses the notion that there is not just the responsibility to reveal mystic truths, but also to behave well as an artist. Rob said that these days, many artists either, quote, start with a discomfort that they transpose to an abstraction and never bring it home, or else take their personal drama and turn it into melodrama, which seems to me a clear definition of what's bad about most American poetry. The rigor of Bruce's work is that it is always personal and never melodramatic, and it is always about a subject who could be you or who could be me, but never about a subject which will never come home to either one of us. Lecture over, the evening's Naumann celebrations went on, talking afterwards at dinner with Rob Storr, telling him eagerly of my museum experience hours before. We began a bit haplessly devising a short list of artists, David Hammons and William Kentridge for two, whose works, like Naumann's, deliver the goods with a strong sense of a curious someone home at both ends of the delivery route. But list-making was not to the point. The conception of a definitive ethics goes nowhere. Even so, there was a lot to pursue. As Rob and I said our goodbyes, I had the feeling that for the two of us to have touched on ethics at all was to have entered into a cabal. How to proceed in the arts, how you spend your life as an artist, is seldom the topic of anyone's work, but an element always there to be inferred by whoever appreciates art's sometimes awkward but nevertheless incontestable status as a form of human behavior. What kind of thing is that for a grown man to be doing? It's an interesting question to ask if a grown-up is doing it and another grown-up is asking. At a certain point, you wonder what, if any, truth is involved, or is what you see just a lot of hard work and materials batting the air? Poetry, Ted Berrigan once said, should be something real, not an interesting lie to tell your mother. The truth that Storr was advancing about Naumann arises within range of the luxury and vertigo of artistic commitment. An artist may be possessed of a sense of appointed task, but given that the sense is always fleeting, what is to be done? The assertion that this or that isn't art is a surefire conversation stopper, and to cede the decision to institutional say-so is as much as to leave culture to the commissioners. Let the commissioners believe it if they like, but the engaged viewer should look to her own devices. Art's behavioral indeterminacy leaves each instant of it forever open to question. In the face of the brief public furor this past year over showing video images of animals bludgeoned to death in a public square, the excuse for which remains unclear, the pronouncement by one of the curators in charge that the space of encounter is sacrosanct thudded down as a vain piece of sacerdotal falderall. The terms of every moral code require perhaps daily periodic testing, but even allowing for all sorts of unpredictable goings-on inside the white cube, no one checks his humanity at the door. Mandelstam's essay on the Addressee is a thoughtful poet's attempt to find connections along a grid, a number of things Mandelstam envisions as analogous to poetry, a letter to a friend, a communing with one's own soul, or a message in a bottle to be retrieved at some unknown destination. He puts in contrast with pseudo-civic poetry and tedious lyrics flying on powerful wings to a providential addressee. The presumptive message-driven art you see in galleries and contemporary museums today knows what it's about and addresses a providential generality, the culture at large, which doesn't exist, or exists so vaguely that it has been substituted for in the minds of artists and administrators by a nebulous cluster, the professionalized circuit of art magazines, museums, and business people. Arthur Danto remarked recently that contemporary art no longer has any enemies, which may be true, but largely because it also has no friends. In fact, it has no society, really, beyond the confines of the art world proper. 16 years ago, Adam Gopnik wrote an article for The New Yorker called The Death of the Audience, in which he told of going as a teenager with his parents to the opening of the Guggenheim in 1959 and being struck by the size and sophistication of the audience, a crowd of people, many of them artists, and many more what used to be called educated laymen, mostly professional people, doctors, lawyers, psychoanalysts, and the like, who took an interest in the arts and which then included as normal fare theater, dance, concert music, poetry, as well as painting and sculpture. According to Gopnik, that audience, the serious museum-going public, was no more. Gopnik has since publicly regretted the piece insofar as he couldn't have foreseen how 10 years later the museums would be full again, fuller than ever, with audio guides selling daily by the gazillions, but his major thesis still holds. By contrast with his late 50s Guggenheim epiphany, he told of going to the opening of the Richard Prince show at the Whitney the year he wrote the article, 1992, and then back the following day. The opening was jammed with the artist's friends and associates and other insiders, but when he returned the next day, it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Gopnik's sense was that, although Prince's work proposed to address weighty issues within American culture at large, there was no large culture for it, only those who already had a stake in furthering its existence. My own experience early on, well into the 1970s anyway, was that artists regularly spent long hours in one another's studios and intensely criticized each other's work, and so did the critics, many of whom were artists themselves, and those who weren't argued separately. By the mid-1980s, if you asked an artist what other artists visited their studio, you would hear, "No one. I don't let anyone in my studio who might steal my ideas." That was when the talk in New York lofts turned intensely to real estate. At the same time, critics told me they never go to studios. Artists are boring, they would say, or else express the fear that a critic known for intimacy with studio environs would lose major points of critical power. Art now has no friends because so many hungry caregivers are in the way. In the 1940s, Clement Greenberg remarked on the bone-crushing isolation suffered by the best artists then in New York. They were isolated because the cultural establishment had no use for them. Artists now, unless they work hard not to be, are isolated, perhaps more definitively, sucked into individual sensory deprivation lounges by trained teams of globally deployed handlers whose engagement with the art and what it means is neither here nor there. We all know in this prolonged time famine that stunts contemporary life, there are only so many hours on the ground between flights. And once on the ground, as David Levi-Strauss recently suggested, the bus is full. Enough artists, with all these excellent people in the know on board. Who needs more art? I think David Levi said something like that. Or you sent it to me. In the perplex of recent human history, the certainties of today's academic ideologues look arrogant to the point of soullessness. Marxism, accurate in its structural understanding, has only a general theory of ethics. By now, the idea that art, artists, and more to the point, art students, are born on the side of fair play, willfully tidy classroom Marxists all, is normal and wrong. It is important to have a first-hand, vivid sense of the issues and stakes involved in philosophical discussion, for which literacy is a good start, and intelligent conversation, including talking back aggressively to what you read, an advanced requirement. But the talk has to advance beyond citation or précis of what you have read. As Storr said, you want it brought home. What Kant or Kristeva has written regarding this or that is of no particular consequence unless you make it so. Depending on what you see in it, on what you see in what is written, what you say or do in turn is the only realization it may ever find. What you get from doing and or looking is very different from what you get from reading about something or what it is supposed to mean. Looking behind the curtain to see the wizard, seeing how a thing works, is interesting, but not as interesting as that it works. At the Action Abstraction show at the Jewish Museum recently, Connie and I followed in the tracks of two men, one of whom, whenever a picture was accompanied by a wall text, which was most of the time, rushed to take in the text, usually a generality from Clement Greenberg or Harold Rosenberg, which he then read aloud and afterward jumped back and, waving in the direction of the picture, called out to his companion, "See?" On the front page of the syllabus for my seminar, In the Culture of Modern Times, I warned, my subject is not teachable. The uncertainty and taste for chaos modernity has espoused have proven to be its greatest strengths, which may be why we find them, first in our student years and afterward, if we buy into the game, endlessly, fearfully shut away with other defective things by instruction on all sides. Secrets the age of reason was privy to, but decided against making public. As Robert Smithson said, all clear ideas tend to be wrong. It seems that the complexities and sheer ordinariness of what really happens when someone writes a poem or paints a picture are pedagogically unspeakable. You can't be tested on them. A little over a year ago, in response to an Art in America special issue on art schools, an art student at UCLA posed the $64,000 question. "I often wonder," she wrote, "is my goal to make art, or is it to contribute the next step in art historic discourse?" To say, as Franz Klein did of Barnett Newman, that the way someone works shows how he thinks art should be, seems almost exotic now. When I was starting to learn about New York art at the end of the 1950s, actually, that coincided that was 1959, which coincides with Gopnik's experience as a younger person, 15 years old. I was 19 or 20. There remained among artists and critics a strenuous criticism that identified artistic activity as clearly admirable or not in behavioral terms and permitted free use in the critical writings of the word exemplary. It really was quite extraordinary to learn the local idiom of art then, to hear that a straight edge in a painting could be deemed too gray flannel by association, or conversely, that a subtle orange patch was truly Trotskyite. Such responses may sound silly now, but the passion and agility behind them exercised an almost mystic glamour. The wonderful elder poet Edwin Denny was someone I learned to look to then. Sensible in every way, better known even today as the best dance critic, Edwin had already lived an extraordinarily full, interesting life and stayed alert and open for more. Alongside Denby's poetry and dance writings, his stories of de Kooning are by now classic reminders of the sort of ethos I can more or less only hint at here. Quote, "Talking to Bill and to Rudy," that's Rudy Burkhardt, "for many years, I found I did not see with a painter's eye. For me, the after-image, as Elaine de Kooning has called it, became one of the ways people behave together. That is, a moral image. The beauty Bill's depression pictures have kept reminds me of the beauty that instinctive behavior in a complex situation can have. Mutual actions mutual actions one has noticed that do not make one ashamed of oneself or others or of one's surroundings either. I am assuming that one knows what it is to be ashamed. The joke of art in this sense is a magnanimity more steady than one notices in everyday life and no better justified." I've read that passage constantly over 50 years. I've quoted it many times before, but only in preparing this talk saw how Edwin advances his moral image anecdotally. Like Ovid's telling of the Golden Age, practically the whole thing is couched in negatives, and the final throwaway line on its moral high note begins stealthily as an aside, and then springs open to quick relief from what Denby reminds us is the normalcy of shame. In a remarkably similar instance, Robert Creely recalled, quote, "It used to be said of William Carlos Williams that the literal fact of his being there gave us one clean man we could utterly depend upon, that nothing could buy his integrity. That neither Williams nor, as Creely goes on to say, de Kooning, exemplary for himself as for Denby, quote, lets us off the hook of our pretensions, bullshit, faking, laziness, you name it," end quote. It was Williams who had said years earlier, looking at a baby he had delivered in the ward at Rutherford Hospital, "You mean to tell me that's full of original sin?" Obviously, being a bearer of artistic activity is not the same, being a bearer of artistic integrity is not the same as, and doesn't promise, being a nice person, much less an all-around good guy. Usually, when something rings true, you remain aware in this veil of distinctions that other things, often things by the same artist, can appear false, indecorous, or sadly so limited as to be puerile or plain stupid, your run-of-the-mill bad art. The question of whether art can be said to be evil, truly reprehensible in some final way, was raised in the forum over the showing of those bludgeoned mammal images in San Francisco, and was quickly left aside, an embarrassment nobody beside the philosopher critic who raised it wanted any part of. Creely reminds us that the Greek for clean sits squarely on one prong of the root for the word sincere. Hence Pound's useful assertion that technique is the test of a writer's sincerity, and a little down the line, Alex Katz's ambition to make a painting so proficient technically that if you say it's bad, you're going to have to say the man's character is bad. Responding to the young dancer Freddie Herco's complaint in The Floating Bear that Paul Taylor's dances weren't made with love, Edwin Denny wrote an angry letter to the editor. Herco, Edwin fumed, is judging Taylor by an idea. This idea, the idea of love and art and the unsoiled life, is shit. If Taylor fails by that, he's doing fine. Herco had better watch his language. An upbeat notebook, this is where it gets really good for the last 3 minutes or so. An upbeat notebook entry on July 16th, 2008, after a trip to Los Angeles. Marlene Dumas, people tend to find her too heavy, which to me is strange because her pictures make me happy. The happiness comes from a sense of truth, but truth is never unalloyed heaviness or gloom, so there must be something else at work. She is funny in the way Guston is, and Guston's Kafka and Goya's dog, the terrible, lumpy thing, shown so plainly, evil so homely, the pain it causes so beyond absurd. The moralist cackles madly, as when reading Hannah Arendt's account of how Eichmann rose through the SS ranks. And Arendt said later, she wrote her book in a kind of rapture. The multiple heads are glories, including the Face of Jesus series. Why do they move me so thoroughly? Given the state of things, unremitting gloom ranks low to middling in my idea of a good time, which includes an admittedly half-gutted sense of decorum. Dumas has said that a strong response to her distressed, predominantly female figures doesn't require identification with her experience of them, but that, quote, contemplation of the work, when it works, gives a physical sensation similar to that suggested by the work. The so-called truth effect, absurdly discredited in photography, operates here at a different level. Truth is not resemblance, but a gist markedly in accord with fact and feeling, literally a truing up with the world as you find it, with all the attendant instabilities every which way. It's in those terms, truth defined as hitting on an indeterminate eventuality, that what an artist makes can be said to be a real right thing. In the last stanza of Elegy, The Streets, the longest of the poems published in his first book in the 1940s, Denby writes, familiar tone within 3,000 years, verse is a civilized, a friendly habit. Nature and money thrust us close and sunder. Verse makes less noise and is a human wonder. I doubt that any of the key words in those 4 lines, working backward, wonder, friendly, civilized, familiar, can be found in the current issue of any art magazine, or for that matter, in what little passes for poetry criticism these days, or else in poetry itself. Criticism tells you what is there. Art should show you something. Without its gratuitous aspect, poetry loses its necessity and also that dosage of insanity that, as Denby said of ballet, does everyone a great deal of good. An Iraqi poet was asked on NPR what poetry meant to him. He had read some poems that reflected the violence that he and others at home dealt with daily, and others that didn't. Conventional love poems, landscape observations, philosophical musing, and such. The aim of poetry, he said, is to keep the language from going insane. In poetry, for it to work, both reader and writer need to be aware that every word counts, for or against the poem, that is. A poem is built word for word, then one, then another, like frame by frame, shot by shot in a film. Without dictating an authoritative point of view, a poem can tell, like beads, the words, phrases you can turn here or there toward what might want to be said. That's part of poetry's sensational impact, where at the edges of meaning, words return to their peculiar physicality, which then provokes undreamed of connotations. It occurs to me that this sensation business, maybe because it was so much in the air for painters at the time, has been with me from when I began to write seriously. A poem's coherence may hang by a thread. Snap that thread, a kind of pattern recognition takes charge. And it is this that sometimes defers or erases syntactic probity, granting the poem a discrete, believable, because no less connectable, ethos all its own. Was that a real poem, or did you just make it up yourself? A member of the audience asked a poet, who then delightedly passed it on to another poet, and eventually it became the title of yet another well-known poet's lecture. It was in a book of Creely's talks was titled that. The question was similar in quick contact and naive splendor to the perception Reeves' Grenade had made of Matisse's crazy little picture. Art may not provide a reason to live, but enough of the time, for those engaged in it, it is amazingly encouraging. For those who make a habit of it, art or poetry may make a life. Being in it is life to them. The extent to which that confluence is about being who you are, the dream of staying in character, may be only by default, as emphasis on the strictly personal usually is. What one looks for is the moment, like a room you can cross, where fact and myth converge so as to be indiscernible, The world helps the artist by revealing mystic truths. I remember Ed Ruscha telling me how when driving around LA, he could see power and rightness in a phrase or image staring out so pointedly at him that he felt obliged to use it, pass it on. Whether an emphasis is there or not, the sensational world, as it occasionally penetrates and opens up to us, is analogous to self-presentation on the stage of everyday experience, as if life itself were watching. The formal fact of a dancer's turnout, beautiful photograph of Franz Klein posed on the cover of a recent Skira monograph, smiling, open-handed, one arm waving in an arc, a little up and out with the then familiar bel canto lilt, Tony Bennett. In the 1930s, when as far as fame was concerned he hadn't a prayer, de Kooning confessed to Rudy Burkhardt that even so, walking through the turnstile in the subway, he expected the bell to ring a little louder. Destiny means you are carrying something. For those in the know, all of history comes down to that, the recitation and the inspired chat that ensues. Wherever it is you have arrived, as if according to plan, at whatever is. You were expecting a detour? Stein said she knew she was popular because she had a small audience. And that's pretty much the state of poetry over centuries. The healthier varieties as ever, avoiding melodrama and cant. Art world art, steeped in the vagaries of cant, could use a small audience to learn who its friends are. Shop talk goes on oblivious. Get out the vote. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think I really went over time. Levi said that you might want to have a conversation. But those who don't should use the pause to parachute out of here. Oh, yeah. Oh, plug it. Plug. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful show. What is it called? NY, New York Y. Y. Right. 1938 album of Rudy Burkhardt photographs, many of which I believe have not been seen, except if you had white gloves on in a room in the Met. It was an album that the Met acquired some years ago, many years ago. Edwin Denny poems and Rudy Burkhardt photographs, and it's in this small photography gallery there now, well into the beginning of 2009, I think. Beautiful show. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Rambling. It's probably a rambling wreck. I don't know. I think that there was a logic to it. Was it a conversation with yourself? No, I hope not. That was exactly what I've designed my life and writings not to be. Yeah, Scott, I'll just interrupt you for a second on that. I want, the struggle with this talk was to not only not be a scold, but obviously one can't, like you walk in the studio and say, no, you can't even walk in and say, now I'm going to be a good artist today. So the whole consideration is got to be sort of an adjustment made, in the secret chambers. Don't you think? I mean, but please go on.
No, it was just the morals and ethics. I just don't
Yeah.
know, but I think there's a certain quality of when something's done, that there's a certain, during the process, it's fine, but in the finality, do I keep it or not?
Yeah.
There's a certain sense of the ethics of, I don't know what that is, but that's kind of where, does it have a right to be?
Yeah. Well, what is that right? That's the thing. I mean, what is that right? I mean, I asked somebody. I kept trying to have this conversation with people, so I hope we can have it. Because it is not just evil, but even that sense of cabal. Like, are we supposed to talk about ethics at all? I'm very interested in the cackle within and around Hannah Arendt's book, where things get really evil, really preposterously so. It's preposterous, and and yet, if you say, for instance, you're a painter, this was partly occasioned by Baudelaire saying one of his quips, I mean, what did he really mean by it? At some point in that 1846 text, he says, painting is never anything but a construction in ethics. So I said to Arthur Danto, what do you think he means by that? He said, well, I guess painting is a series of choices. Yeah, but it's not like, hamburger or tuna salad. So what is the nature of the choice? And what keeps running back to me, and what can only be, again, something that in a certain way you've got in your back pocket, is that thing that Klein said about Barnett Newman, that he said, you can see that Barney paints the way he thinks painting ought to be. That's a very interesting idea, along with, asking what kind of thing is that for a grown man to be doing. Yeah, I mean, all those things imply, what should we be doing? And I don't, it's not as if I, as those Egyptian sculptures made me think of it for that day. Periodically, it becomes sort of critical. It's not like something I think that anybody should go around with furrowed brow. I certainly don't, and I don't pretend to, considering all the time. It's just that it is in the air, but it's not in the air of enough art, and certainly of enough art criticism. It's just not. It pretends to be by way of what is supposed to be political discourse, but that discourse is so generalized that to me it's practically useless. Yeah.
I've never been sure whether minimalist art and its covert conceptual art was actually inherently more ethical than other periods of art in the 20th century. But from the readings of the artists of that period, there seems to be certain kinds of ethical claims either made explicitly or implicitly. And over the years, I thought that's one of the strongest, could be one of the strongest dimensions. But as I watched the art push along over the years, I find myself saying how utterly corporate it is in nature. So I get confused.
Well, there was the point at which Robert Morris said, having done this, done that. And I think, it's a paradox in a certain way, that what was it he said? It was marvelous. Irving probably has it verbatim, that the culture is involved in the hostile act of absorbing anything we do. And by the culture, he means corporate, Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it doesn't, the paradox is that it doesn't negate the art totally. You can make it so if you want to make that case. But I remember the second big Frank Stella retrospective, the second retrospective Frank Stella in the basement of that particular Museum of Modern Art that William Rubin did. It was so cramped, it looked like some sort of, circus had been stuffed, like all the gear for some circus had been stuffed. So I was frustrated, and I knew that there was a way to see that kind of Stella the way one should see it. And God, there's got to be a Stella somewhere around here. Sure enough, 4 blocks away on Lexington Avenue, in a remarkable corporate lobby, you can still see it today. He's the Prince of Painters for corporate America, and that was true. But does that make that wasn't going to ruin Frank Stella for me? That's just an aspect.
Do you think it's the receivership that changes the value of the art as it goes?
Yeah, a lot of it is receivership and like what I say, caregiving. I mean, really, I think that I had a paragraph in this about the Whitney Biennial, and it was also about, following up on what Gopnik said about Richard Prince, and thinking, well, okay, Richard Prince and the Whitney Biennial this year, you could go there and you could say, well, what I said was the art was probably okay. Maybe Richard Prince is, this whole business of judging artists at what level they're hyped at. And then you come to them and say, well, what if Julian Schnabel was just okay? What are you worried about? Same thing with Richard Prince, and same thing with maybe all of the artists who were in the Whitney Biennial. But there was something repellent and stultifying about the way that all of this stuff was arranged according to an a priori understanding of the state of the culture. And so that's not the art's fault. That's handling, and that's what I find increasingly intrusive, and like really in the way, And I had lunch with somebody who's been an arts professional for probably her whole life, probably now in her late 70s or something like that, and I was stunned where all of a sudden this question of what is, excuse me, the arts professional of this period, whatever you think that is, and she practically leapt across the table and said, "They're in the way." Wow, it's so true, but I'm amazed that she said it to me, but it was like a satori or something. Yeah.
Several things. First of all, I'd love you to talk so much that I know about 3 classes I'd like to read. This ties into the question about form. I think you gave us a wonderful example of ethics and form in the way that you gave the talk, because it was sort of a conversation over several different areas, and I really thank you for that. In the way it sort of morphed into all of these different areas. So, one of the things I was interested in was, on a concrete level, was what you were talking about was the animal that was being, the piece of artwork you were talking about in the cube, the animal, because...
Well, cube is just the white cube, the gallery space, right.
Because I was recently talking about the controversy of the dog that was supposedly in the exhibition in, I can't remember, in South America, that was tied up, that was slowly dying. And that turned out to be a quote-unquote hoax.
Oh.
But is actually, after you do the research, quite really brilliant kind of conceptual art piece that is not being given enough discussion.
I don't know about that one.
Okay, because I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about the Hardcat magazine, and they, when it first came out, and they refused to talk about it. It ties into what you're talking about with the ethics. They said, we don't want to talk about it, have it discussed, because we don't want to perpetuate any discussion about it. And I was like, well, I wanted to talk about it in the largest way. John Haraway has a book on animals, and all this work on animals and art, and it was like, well, they wouldn't allow the ethical discussion even to be brought up within sort of like, no, all of that is too horrible. So
Mhm.
it just occurred to me that there is a situation where it's almost as though you can't talk about ethics because it's too complicated. We can only talk about condemning, letting in, or letting out kind of ideas. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's what, you know,
I've heard about
the weird thing for me is that, you know, art criticism and art historical writing now is jam-packed with, you know, this kind of, you know, all kinds of finger-pointing and late capitalism, this, and, you know, all of, anything that you can get hold of that's along that sort of line, but that has nothing to do with what you're talking about. Or and there's no translating that kind of. This is not. I mean, I'm not against. Please understand me. I mean, where's my Obama button? I'm not against social progress, you know. But you know, it just doesn't work in the street,
Right.
you know, and or in the drawing room, right? Yeah.
But Phil, how does art deal with evil, the tragic sense of life, with all of these negative things? You sort of wanted it skirted it.
Well, I mean, you want to what? Or skirted it? I skirted it. Oh, that's obvious. I mean, how art can is look at what Guston did in the last 10 years of his life, and much of his preoccupation was, you know, just as Kentridge, much of the preoccupation was with what would it be like, as Philip said, what would it be like to be really evil? Which is, you know, kind of an interesting question. Like, well, don't I know? You know? But at the same time, those two artists have a lot more going on than that. You know, because it's not just. I mean, it's like, you know, how then again do you place it? Golub seemed to be in those mercenary pictures very, very good at that, sort of locating an evil in the world that connected to almost like anything, or, you know, ordinary life. I mean, partly the strategy, you could say, of putting the mercenaries in the interrogations in the context of images taken from porn magazines, you know, and then putting them in the tomato soup of a Barnett Newman painting. You know, it was really, I mean, so that it fleshed out, right? So we have plenty of you know, instances of people dealing with evil. I mean, it would be very interesting. Nobody, to my knowledge, I think Dory Ashton went some lengths towards this. I think one of the great works of the 20th century was Robert Rauschenberg's Canto, you know, the Dante drawings. And nobody that I know of, I don't think even Dory did this really, was, you know, went after them as like, you know, well, he chose hell, he chose the inferno, to which evil was consigned. You know, what do you see of that there? You know, I don't, you know, only every 5 years do I get a chance to look at those images because they're not always up. I wish somebody would publish, you know, a popular book, because it's an amazing thing. But, you know, we have, I mean, as people, who was it said it? Williams about Ezra Pound, who began to, the cantos turned into hell. And then, you know, I think it was Williams said, well, your hell is only for other people. Yeah. Where are you there? You know? Which is interesting, because that's the flip of, you mean that's full of original sin? That baby. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, who said that? Oh, huh? beautiful lies in different languages, all in different languages, Frank O'Hara. I mean, he must be meaning that, you know, that art, Picasso said something like that, and so did Baudelaire, that art is a pack of lies.
So Bill,
Yeah.
I was struck
Thank you.
by
Hey, Harris.
receivership
Yeah.
being used between this gentleman and yourself, because it's a bankruptcy term.
Yeah, I never understood. It's in, am I in receivership?
I know, I think you just passed the ball, but unfortunately, you know, because the defense alignment or wasn't. But anyway, regardless, no, I was thinking, you know, well, you're talking, it seems, about, you know, kind of bankruptcy. We'll be hearing the term receivership a lot, I believe, as things develop, but I was also, you know, feel free to comment or not on these comments, just to add to the conversation, but I was wondering if you might have an example of poetry that doesn't take personal drama, that does not take personal drama and turn it into melodrama, but rather creates poetry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, present company excluded, like your own poetry, you know? Yeah, I mean, sure. I think most of the poetry that there are about 8 poets in the room. Yeah, right. Exclude them all. But the ones the poetry that we like, for the most part, does not do that. Does not take, you know, I mean, it's just like top 40 songwriting, you know, you know, there was somebody came out with an album this past year, and she said, you know, she like took the album right back. That's what I mean by killing your addressee. Take the album right back, because it was like, oh yeah, I was all fucked up when I wrote those songs, and I hope I never write any songs like that again. Yeah, and say, well, you know, well, now what am I supposed to do? Listen? Yeah. No. No, I'm not. No, I mean, I said that in you know, a sort of voce convoluted ways, but.
The whole modernist tradition is you overthrow the morality of your fathers because you realize it's a pseudo-morality.
Right.
And so the next generation is always doing something that the older generation is saying, oh, that's irresponsible, and that's like,
Yeah.
that's selling out.
Well, you know, yeah, that's, I mean, that is sort of unavoidable.
At this moment, and there will be somebody that's like a beacon of exemplary moral character. It may not be just, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like by how many turns over how many years has Taos or Santa Fe been ruined? You know, I mean, oh, you know, you should have been here. I mean, that's like a golden age idea, and I realized that was a pitfall. But no. I mean, first of all, I didn't say it as clearly as always it has to be said. No, there's no absolute. I mean, ethics, morality, all that, it's all up for grabs. And moment by moment, situation by, that's just obvious. Though obviously to some people it's not, because against the strength and pleasures and truth of uncertainty, you have now a seriously encroaching culture of certainty. I mean, it has encroached, fearful, you know, all around us. You know, fundamentalism. What else is fundamentalism of any stripe? in any locale but that, you know. Yeah, sure. Probably anybody, you have two things that are operative as you come into this mess. One is the first, I guess, when you're young, you feel like it couldn't be happening now, particularly where you are. And even growing up in New York, that was true for me. And then there's the thing of, oh, it hits you, and nothing's ever going to hit you quite like that, like it does when you're 16 or 18 or something. And so there are these sort of cherished somethings that, you know, that are exemplary in ways that nothing else ever will be that way. And if you're lucky, you keep going, finding new things that pop, you know. And the worst is, and you see it, you know, you see it more in critics, who I think, you know, anybody who sets out to be a critic should really consider, you know, what's the point at which you check out, you know, because there is no sadder spectacle than the one who gave his or her heart to a moment, and the moment has passed, and everything has been shit ever since, you know. And I've seen that, you know, it's terrible. But we have people in the room who have been at this for 60 some odd years and haven't flagged in their love of it and their curiosity, you know. And but it's, the other thing is maybe more common. So then you think, you know, a critic should only be a critic for 5 years or 10, or something, if even. I don't even know if a critic should be a critic. You know, it seems like a funny thing, like a shingle. Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm going to play something, and I'm a student here, and I certainly didn't experience you as an old man. But part of your discussion tonight was prescriptive. You were telling students how to read. So we're reading that can't mean anything unless you grab hold of it and make it your own. So in that vein, earlier in your discussion, you were talking about the golden age being nostalgic for a time that never was, and modernity or modernism being nostalgic for the moment?
Present.
For the present. So
Or present tense, yeah.
Could take a moment and talk about that some more in a prescriptive manner, how to avoid.
Oh. Well, it's not really, oh no.
It smells like melodrama to me, any
Oh.
nostalgia, so.
Well, you know, nostalgia is literally, it's homesickness. You know, it's like neuralgia. I mean, it's, you know, you got an ache, right? The algia part, right? And I don't think there's, you know, I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. A nostalgia for the a nostalgia for the present is that you somehow, you know, where is it? And I mean, I think that's been, minimalism was certainly about that, because the business of presence was what minimal sculptors mostly talked about. Poetry has had this interesting relationship to time in the sense of any kind of narrative going on inside poetry. That you know, Frank O'Hara's poems, the "I do this, I do that" poems are experience of some sort. This is not melodrama, because it's experience written into the present tense. And you can't ever, there is an essential mystery in it. Like, how did it get so present and stay there? You know, and you can say, oh, yeah, well, he was walking around Madison Avenue. But no. Right here, now, in this poem is it, you know, it being the present. And so that's that's drastic. to be able to put it there. I think eventually, I don't even know where the modern really begins and ends, if it ended. But there was this business of a huge tug into an idealized past moment, this golden age idea. It was really something about the conditions of life in modernity, you can call it capitalism, really were insufferable, or are. I mean, that's at least something that's reflected in the literature. It's just insufferable. We can't live like this. There's got to be some other way. And it's kind of weird because you think, well, you got toilets. Modern medicine, for which I am grateful, and other things, museums, all this entertainment around us, and then, well, if we can't go back somewhere, then we can make a facsimile of it in a reasonable future, where everybody will be happy and treat each other fairly, which is completely infantile. But everybody loves that idea. That's, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I can't. I don't mean it to be. I didn't mean to be prescriptive or proscriptive or. I couldn't help, and I kept trying to cut it out. And maybe this is the end of it for me in that way. Of so much about what happens in the art world pisses me off. Just the mechanics of it. It's not the art, because if you don't like it, you don't have to look at it. Really, But it's sometimes I find the talk around it, and the way, and also having taught in an art school for 24 years, really, and because teaching, as you know, in an art school now, so much is not studio courses, and I was teaching non-studio courses, and Pache, my estimable colleagues, some of whom conducted what I used to call courses in meathead Marxism. What's going on here? And I know it's born of the same thing that. The rest of my next lecture will be on how 1968 destroyed education in the Western world. So, it's like that. It's born of the thing that you got to have some. You can't have an apolitical education, so we're going to make education really political. And get down to it, yeah.
You talked a lot about the past of art and how it leads up to the way things are now. Do you predict? I don't know you're not.
I don't predict.
Okay. But do you think there's going to be a backlash against institutionalization in the universe, or do you think it's just going to escalate?
I don't know, but no, because I use this term. There are two terms really. There's museum type art and art world art, and actually, in a way, they're the same thing. But museum-type art implies something about, the museums are designed to accommodate certain sizes, and things. It's more and more rare to walk into a room in a museum and find drawings like this. San Francisco Museum doesn't have any rooms like that. And then there are the artists who are actually, this is part of, I think, what Rob was saying about Naumann. There are the artists who operate perfectly well within this context of art world art, but who are really elsewhere. And then there are ones who will never be part of it. And a lot of those are, or some of those are, the artists that poets tend to know and and collaborate with and collect their works and all that. And there's no reason why they couldn't be, but they aren't. Though sometimes it's because what they do seems sort of anachronistic. I'm thinking of all the works that were in Robert Duncan's house, about which a film has been made, and these works look a little bit like they could have. There's a sort of Bloomsbury flavor to them. They're beautiful. That's the most salient quality of them, is that they're beautiful, and and it's very strange. That sort of puts them out to pasture.
Bill,
Yeah.
since I first met you at college 50 years ago, just about this time of year, I always wondered, and I've never heard you speak about why you went to San Francisco. And what it did for you. The question
Well, what it did to me. I went to San Francisco because the same reason I left Brown about 6 months after we met, Richard. I needed a change. Yeah, well, no, but I knew instantly. I'm not going back to school, and I'm going to move to New York. I'm going to go back to New York. And so that was really it. What it did to me, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. And first of all, I moved to Bolinas, which is not San Francisco. And, I fell apart and regrouped. Tom has said, "Don't get lost out there." Yeah. Huh?
In reference to Ken Johnson and Richard Malasco.
Yes.
Question and Will as well.
Yes.
The talk tonight reminds me of the aesthetic tradition and individual talent.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go further back in the time of space. Let's say refer to Dr. Edwin Young of the century.
Yeah.
Want to say that? Why is it that we all born as original but die as copies? And then 2 centuries later, Collinet will say, nothing is new under the sun, but for man everything is.
Mm-hmm.
So the two contrary opposition, and adding to what Franz Klein said about Newman,
Yeah.
it happens simultaneously.
Yeah.
The flip, if you can correct me, saying to a friend that look at Bonnie's painting is like rushing to a corporate building.
Oh.
And you are late, and by the time you enter the elevator, it's about time to close.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was that thing about pull down the shade. Yeah. Well, there was that. My favorite was the Gustin and de Kooning going to the Newman show, and either the first or the second, and then walking down 57th Street in silence for about a block and a half, and then de Kooning turned to Gustin and said, "Well, we don't have to think about that anymore." What I remember most, and I actually reread it for that class, and wanted the students to read the Eliot essay that you mentioned, "Tradition and the Individual Talent," and which is a great title anyway, right? In that, well, I mean, it is. You could replace it and say conversation and the individual psyche. And say, what happens? And at some point, Eliot, what he's saying is he's caught the wind, he's caught the drift of something that does that has happened since at least since the mid 18th century, and that's where somebody says What do we need them for? We know so much more than they do. And Eliot says precisely, and they are what we know. Yeah. And you know, then there's the question of whether that holds anymore. Does it hold if your idea of art history, as I found increasingly and aggressively at the Art Institute, who can gainsay it if this is the way you want it to be? That art history begins with Andy. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter really. But that's a different view than, and you know, and of course, one has to remember Eliot's sense of. I mean, Eliot walked into the cave at Lascaux and had an epiphany and exclaimed, you know, because he's fancy in French, quel grand goulade, which meant it's been downhill ever since. 30,000 years, you know. And, you know, so he's some kind of, talk about loving the past, you know. So he's an arch conservative, and of a very dangerous kind. You know, I mean, the way he and Pound were very dangerous in that conservatism, because you know you can see where the political alignment developed, and this isn't to write them off, you know, as poets or artists in any way, but really as cautionary tales, they exist too. So you know, you both ethically and strategically negotiate your relation to what's called the past. The best thing Pound did was to say that it's all, you know, to exercise that sense of simultaneity. And I like that, and that's what my whole business of the history as a field or a social gathering is. It's all here. And it's not like, yes, you should know the social history of Siena in the 1400s to really appreciate what Sasetta is doing. But at the same time, you can do what Reeves Grenade did and really look at those pictures, and it's good if you have the information, you know, but it's also important to look at it as if it's a contemporary thing, you know, because it is. And you know, and so Pound reading Cavalcanti or some Chinese poet from way back, I forget dynasties, you know, has got that wonderful critical sense that it's a contemporary conversation that he's having with what's left of those writers. Maybe we've done enough.